Welcome back to While You Sleep. Really glad you are here tonight. If you enjoy these stories, a like and a subscribe means more than you might think. It helps other people who are lying awake find this channel. So if you can, do that now while you are still looking at the screen, and then we will get you settled. Lie down if you are not already there. Pull the covers up. Let the day go. Take a slow breath in and let it out. Tonight, we are going to the bottom of the world, to a place so remote and so extreme that most human beings will never see it in their lifetimes. A continent larger than Europe, buried under 2 miles of ice, ringed by the most violent ocean on Earth, and governed by an international treaty that has kept it largely closed to the public for more than 60 years. Antarctica, the white continent, the last true wilderness. It is also, depending on who you ask, the most secret place on Earth. A place where governments have done things they will not explain, where scientists have found things they will not fully describe, where a lake the size of a small country has been sealed from the surface of the world for 15 million years, and where the ground beneath the ice holds structures that should not, by any conventional understanding of geology, be there at all. Tonight we are going in. As far as the evidence, the history, and the questions will take us, let your shoulders drop. Let your breath slow. The story will carry you from here. Chapter 1. The map that should not exist. In 1929, a German theologian named Gustav Deissmann was cataloguing a collection of old documents held in the Topkapi Palace Museum in Istanbul. Among the faded papers and scrolls, he found something unexpected. A piece of gazelle skin parchment, hand drawn in intricate detail, dated to 1513. It was a world map created by an Ottoman admiral and cartographer named Piri Reis. The map was remarkable for its time. It showed the coastlines of Europe and Africa with an accuracy that was impressive for the early 16th century. It showed the eastern coast of South America in detail that was consistent with what European explorers had mapped by that point. All of that was historically interesting, but not extraordinary. What was extraordinary was the bottom of the map. There, extending along the southern edge of the known world, was a landmass, a coastline, drawn with the same confident, detailed hand as the rest of the map. A continuous southern continent, with bays and inlets and mountain ranges rendered in recognizable form. Antarctica was not officially discovered until the early 19th century, 300 years after Piri Reis drew his map. When geographers and historians began analyzing the Piri Reis map in the 20th century, the implications of that southern landmass became impossible to ignore. A professor named Charles Hapgood argued in his 1965 book, Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings, that the coastline on the Piri Reis map was not a guessed at or imagined landmass, but an accurate representation of the Antarctic coastline as it would have appeared before the ice sheet formed. He argued that Piri Reis, who noted in his own annotations that he had compiled his map from a collection of much older source charts, had been working from documents that preserved geographical knowledge stretching back thousands of years. Knowledge that should not have been possible for the era in which those charts were drawn. Hapgood went further. He calculated that the southern coastline on the Piri Reis map matched, with surprising precision, the subglacial topography of Queen Maud Land in Antarctica. Not the ice-covered surface as we see it today, the bedrock underneath, the shape of the land that would be visible if you stripped away every inch of ice. The mainstream scientific response was measured but skeptical. Most glaciologists maintain that Antarctica has been covered by its ice sheet for roughly 34 million years. For the map to show an ice-free Antarctic coastline, someone would have had to survey it 34 million years before human beings existed. But Hapgood had an answer for that too. He proposed that the Earth had undergone a catastrophic geographical shift around 9,500 years before the current era. A crustal displacement that moved Antarctica from a temperate position to its current polar location, after which the ice began to form. If he was right, Antarctica had been accessible and mappable within the span of human civilization, and whoever had mapped it had left records that somehow survived, were copied across generations, and eventually ended up in the hands of a 16th century Ottoman admiral who had no idea what he was preserving. The mainstream rejected the crustal displacement theory. The evidence for it, geologists said, was simply not there. But the map itself is real. The parchment is real. The southern coastline is real. And no one has produced an entirely satisfactory explanation for exactly what Piri Reis thought he was drawing when he put it there. It remains in the Topkapi Palace Museum in Istanbul. You can go and look at it. Chapter 2. The Germans in the Ice. In December 1938, a German cargo ship called the Schwabenland left the port of Hamburg and headed south. Aboard were 82 crew members, 2 Dornier flying boats perched on catapult ramps on the ship's deck, and a mission that the Nazi government had given only a partial explanation for in public. The official purpose of the expedition, the third German Antarctic expedition, was practical and commercial. Germany at the time was heavily dependent on Norway for whale oil, which it needed for margarine, soap, and explosives. The idea was to find a suitable location for a German whaling station in Antarctica, reducing that dependency. A legitimate economic goal. Nothing especially unusual about it. But the mission also had classified elements. There was an instruction to scout potential locations for a future German naval base. And Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, had personally backed the expedition, which gave it a level of official attention that a commercial whaling survey would not normally attract. The Schwabenland arrived at the Princess Martha coast of Antarctica on the 19th of January 1939. The 2 Dornier flying boats were catapulted from the deck and began a series of aerial survey flights over the interior. In 7 flights, they covered more than 600,000 square kilometers of previously unmapped territory, the largest aerial survey of Antarctica that had been conducted to that point. The crew photographed the landscape below and, at intervals, pushed out the hatch of the aircraft a distinctive kind of marker. Aluminium darts, 1.2 meters long, tipped with steel cones, and stamped on 3 fins with swastikas, dropped across the interior to symbolically claim the territory for the Third Reich. The area was named Neuschwabenland, New Swabia, and on the 19th of August 1939, Germany formally claimed it as German territory. The expedition was back in Hamburg by April. 7 weeks later, Germany invaded Poland, and Neuschwabenland its aluminium marker darts buried somewhere under the ice, became a footnote to a much larger catastrophe. But the footnote refused to stay buried, because in the years after the Second World War, something strange happened to the story of the German Antarctic expedition. It grew. In 1947, a Hungarian writer named Ladislas Sabo published a book claiming that the Nazi expedition had done far more than aerial surveys. He claimed the Schwabenland had been part of a mission to establish a hidden underground base in Antarctica, one that used a network of naturally occurring subglacial caves warmed by geothermal heat, a base capable of sheltering not just scientists and soldiers, but the senior leadership of the Third Reich if the war went badly. The base was given a name in conspiracy circles: Base 211, or New Berlin. The theory grew with each retelling. Hitler had not died in the Berlin bunker. He had escaped by submarine to Antarctica. Eva Braun was with him. Senior Nazi scientists had brought advanced technology. The base was still operational, hidden under the ice, waiting for the day it could re-emerge. None of this is supported by evidence. The Schwabenland was at the Antarctic coast for approximately 6 weeks, building a permanent underground base in an interior that no one had yet reached, in one of the most inhospitable environments on Earth. In 6 weeks, while also conducting a full aerial survey, was simply not possible. No supply route for such a base has ever been identified. No physical trace of Base 211 has ever been found. But what is documented is stranger than the legend in a quiet way. Hundreds of German U-boats were unaccounted for at the end of the Second World War. Argentina was a known escape route for senior Nazi figures. The submarine corridor between South America and the Southern Ocean was real, and the United States military, in the last months of 1946, launched the largest and most expensive military expedition in the history of Antarctic exploration. Chapter 3. Operation High Jump. On the 26th of August 1946, Admiral Chester Nimitz, the most senior officer in the United States Navy, announced that a massive combined military expedition would sail for Antarctica that December. It would be called Operation High Jump, officially titled the United States Navy Antarctic Development Program. The scale of it was extraordinary. 13 ships, 33 aircraft, including newly acquired helicopters, a full aircraft carrier, 4,700 military personnel, the largest military force ever sent to the Antarctic. The official objectives were the ones Nimitz stated publicly: to train naval personnel in cold weather operations, to test equipment and ships under polar conditions, to establish a research base, to conduct scientific surveys and mapping. But there were classified elements. Historian Diane Olsen Bellanger confirmed in 2007 that the Navy had also been given secret orders to establish American territorial claims in Antarctica. And there was another pressure. The Cold War was beginning. Soviet eyes were on the polar regions. Any Soviet presence in Antarctica, any base or territorial foothold in those waters, would represent a strategic threat to the American mainland via the southern approach. The United States needed to understand what was there. Operation High Jump was commanded by Rear Admiral Richard Byrd, the most famous polar explorer in American history. Byrd had made 5 Antarctic expeditions over the course of his life. He was the first person to fly over the South Pole. He had survived a winter alone in a tiny hut at the Bolling Advance Base in conditions that nearly killed him. He understood Antarctica better than almost any living American. The operation began in December 1946. 13 ships carved through the pack ice. Aircraft were launched. Mapping flights covered 1.5 million square miles of the continent. Photographs and geological data were collected in quantities that had never been gathered before. And then, after just 3 months, the operation ended, nearly 8 months earlier than planned. Byrd, on his return to the United States, held a press conference. He said the operation had been a success. He described the mapping and the data. He was measured, professional, the decorated admiral who always knew what to say. But he also said something else, something that has been quoted in Antarctic conspiracy literature ever since, with varying degrees of accuracy and context. Byrd warned that the United States should adopt measures of protection against hostile invasions from the polar regions. He spoke of aircraft that could fly from pole to pole at incredible speed. He described the possibility of an enemy capable of striking America from the Arctic or the Antarctic with no warning. Whether he was speaking about the Soviet Union, about the theoretical military capabilities of an adversary who might one day base forces in polar regions, or about something else entirely, depends on how you read him. What is not disputed is the early withdrawal. 4,700 men, 13 ships, the largest polar expedition in history, home after 3 months, with no public explanation for why the timeline was cut so dramatically short. The Soviet Naval Journal at the time noted that American military circles appeared to be seeking to subject the polar regions to their control. They were watching, and so, it seems, was everyone. Chapter 4. The lake, that time forgot. Beneath the East Antarctic ice sheet, roughly 800 miles from the South Pole, directly under the Russian research station at Vostok, there is a lake. It is not a small lake. It is approximately 160 miles long and 30 miles wide. It is more than 800 meters deep in places. It holds nearly 5,400 cubic kilometers of fresh water. It is roughly the size of Lake Ontario, and it has been completely sealed from the surface of the world for somewhere between 15 and 30 million years. Lake Vostok was first suspected to exist in the 1960s, when Soviet scientists noticed that the ice above it behaved differently from the surrounding sheet. Ice core data and aerial radar surveys through the 1970s and 80s gradually confirmed what was below. In the mid-90s, seismic surveys made it definitive. There was a liquid freshwater lake under 2.5 miles of ice, and it had been there in complete darkness, under enormous pressure, cut off from the atmosphere and from every surface ecosystem on Earth since before our species existed. Scientists understood immediately what this meant. Lake Vostok was not just a geographical curiosity. It was potentially a window into one of the most fundamental questions in biology. Could life survive in conditions of total darkness, extreme pressure, near freezing temperatures, and complete isolation for millions of years? And if it could, what would it look like after that long? Russian scientists began drilling toward the lake in the 1990s. It was an agonizingly slow process, complicated by the extreme conditions at Vostok Station, where the coldest temperature ever recorded on Earth had been measured. -89.2 degrees Celsius. a temperature so cold that unprotected skin freezes in seconds and exposed metal becomes so brittle it shatters. On the 5th of February 2012, after nearly 2 decades of drilling, a Russian drill team punched through the final meters of ice and reached the lake. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The pressure differential between the lake water and the borehole above, it was so extreme that lake water shot up the drill shaft like a geyser and instantly froze in place. A plug of lake ice, flash frozen before it could spill, sealing the borehole as if the lake had sealed itself. That frozen plug was extracted the following year and analyzed. The results produced 3,000 unique genetic sequences. 94% came from bacteria, 6% from more complex organisms, including fungi and what appeared to be small crustaceans. The DNA fragments were from organisms that had evolved in total darkness, in complete isolation, for longer than humans have existed in any form. The scientific community greeted the findings with cautious interest and significant controversy. The Russian team had used kerosene as a drilling fluid, which critics noted could easily have introduced surface bacteria into the samples, contaminating any reading of native lake life. The Russians rejected the criticism. The debate was never fully resolved, but underneath the controversy, something remained. The lake was real, the isolation was real, and something was living in it. In 2025, a colossal buried geological structure was detected in the same region of East Antarctica by satellite mapping. Its nature and origin have not been fully explained. It sits in the bedrock beneath the ice, in the same area as Lake Vostok, and its dimensions are large enough that whatever it is not small. What it is, no one has yet said publicly. Chapter 5. What the ice is hiding. Antarctica is not a flat expanse of ice. Beneath the surface, it is one of the most geologically complex and varied landscapes on Earth. A landscape that, because of the 2 miles of ice above it, almost no human being has ever seen directly. What scientists have been able to map through ice-penetrating radar and seismic surveys over the past 60 years has produced some results that are, in their own quietly scientific way, extraordinary. The Gamburtsev subglacial mountains are a mountain range buried beneath the East Antarctic ice sheet. They were first detected by Soviet seismic surveys in 1958. They have never been seen by human eyes. No one has ever stood on their peaks or walked their valleys. Everything we know about them comes from instruments and radar. What makes the Gamburtsevs unusual is not their existence. Antarctica has subglacial mountain ranges that is known. What makes them unusual is their shape. Mountain ranges in the interior of ancient, stable continental plates, like Antarctica, are supposed to be old. They are supposed to have been worn down by billions of years of geological pressure and erosion into low, rounded forms. The Gamburtsevs are not. They are sharp. They are peaked. They look, on radar, like the Alps, young mountains. Mountains that have somehow retained their shape in a place, and for a duration where that shape should not have been possible. Geologists have proposed explanations. Perhaps ancient rifting in the bedrock preserved the range. Perhaps the ice itself has protected the peaks from the erosion that would otherwise have ground them down. These explanations are plausible. They are also not fully satisfying. Then there are the pyramids. In the Ellsworth Mountains in West Antarctica, a series of cracks rise above the ice in shapes that are, to put it carefully, suggestive, four-sided, triangular, their faces angled in a way that, to an observer with a tendency toward pattern recognition, recalls the geometry of a pyramid. Photographs circulate online regularly, with captions describing them as evidence of an ancient civilization, structures too geometrically precise to be natural formations. The geological explanation is a process called freeze-thaw erosion, which over millions of years can carve mountain peaks into angular, faceted shapes called nunataks. It is a real process. It is well documented in polar geology, and it genuinely does produce formations that look, from certain angles, like pyramids. Whether the Antarctic formations are natural nunataks or something more is a question that cannot be definitively answered without excavation that is not currently possible. And then there is the Wilkes Land anomaly. Discovered in 2006 by satellite gravity measurements, it is a massive gravitational disturbance beneath the Wilkes Land region, East Antarctica. It spans more than 300 kilometers in diameter. It lies buried deep beneath the ice sheet. Its origin is disputed. Some researchers believe it is the impact crater of a massive asteroid that struck Earth around 250 million years ago, potentially the impact that triggered the largest mass extinction in planetary history, the Permian extinction event that wiped out more than 90% of all species on Earth. If it is an impact crater of that scale, it would be the largest known impact site on the planet. Something happened there, enormous and ancient, and it is still sitting under the ice, still being slowly mapped by instruments that were not available to anyone a generation ago. There is also the matter of the particle physics. The IceCube Neutrino Observatory is a scientific instrument embedded in the Antarctic ice at the South Pole. It was built at a cost of $279 million to detect neutrinos, the near massless particles that pass through ordinary matter almost without interaction. In 2017, the facility detected something that should not have happened: high-energy cosmic ray particles blasting upward from deep within the Earth. According to the standard model of physics, this is impossible. High-energy particles of the type detected should be stopped by the mass of the planet. They should not be able to pass through the Earth and emerge at the Antarctic surface. The detection prompted immediate scientific debate. No consensus explanation has been reached. It remains, as of 2026, the most significant challenge to the standard model of particle physics produced by any experiment currently running. Something beneath Antarctica is generating or channeling particles in ways that current physics cannot explain. What it is, nobody has publicly said. Chapter 6: The Treaty and the Question. On the 1st of December, 1959, 12 nations gathered in Washington and signed an agreement that would govern the most remote continent on Earth, the Antarctic Treaty. It came into force in 1961 and has since been signed by more than 50 nations. Its provisions are, on the surface, straightforward. Antarctica is designated as a zone for peaceful scientific cooperation. Military activity is prohibited. Nuclear testing is prohibited. All territorial claims are frozen, neither recognized nor extinguished. Signatories have the right to inspect each other's installations. The continent is to be used solely for science. In 1991, an additional protocol designated Antarctica a natural reserve, prohibiting mining and all resource extraction for scientific purposes. These are reasonable provisions for a remote and fragile environment. The treaty has been largely successful at preventing the kind of territorial conflict that competing national claims might otherwise have produced. It is widely cited as a model of international cooperation. But there is a question worth sitting with. The Antarctic Treaty was signed in 1959, just 12 years after Operation High Jump, just 14 years after the end of the Second World War. The nations that signed it, the United States, the Soviet Union, Britain, France, Australia, Argentina, Norway, and others, had spent the preceding decade racing each other to establish claims and conduct expeditions in Antarctica. They had been competing. They had been maneuvering. And then, in 1959, they stopped. They agreed, all of them, to share the continent, to keep it demilitarized, to disclose their installations to each other's inspectors, to freeze their territorial ambitions. Nations at the height of the Cold War, barely speaking to each other in any other context, agreed on Antarctica, agreed so completely and so quickly that the treaty was negotiated and signed within a single year. Why? The official answer is that the International Geophysical Year of 1957 to 1958, a period of intense scientific collaboration across ideological lines, had demonstrated that cooperation in Antarctica was both possible and mutually beneficial, and that the momentum of that collaboration was the foundation for the treaty. That is a reasonable answer. It may well be the true one. But the question lingers, because if you approach Antarctica not from the assumption of benign cooperation, but from the assumption of competition, the speed and completeness of the agreement is unusual. Nations in competition do not typically agree so quickly and so thoroughly to share something they have been racing to claim, unless they have a reason, unless they have found something that changes the calculation, something that makes cooperation more important than competition. What that something might be, no official record specifies. Chapter 7. The Visitors. Since the Antarctic Treaty was signed, a number of notable figures have made highly publicized visits to the continent that were, in terms of their official explanations, somewhat difficult to account for. In 2016, United States Secretary of State John Kerry visited Antarctica during the final weeks of the Obama administration. He was the most senior American government official ever to visit the continent. The stated reason was to observe the effects of climate change firsthand. It was, by any measure, an unusual destination for a sitting Secretary of State in the final weeks of a presidential term. Kerry made no significant public statements about what he saw or learned that differed from the climate change message. Also in 2016, the Russian Orthodox Patriarch Kirill, the leader of the Russian Orthodox Church, made a visit to Antarctica. He blessed the waters at a Russian research station, held a service, and then left. Religious leaders do not typically make pilgrimages to scientific research stations in the Antarctic. No fuller explanation was given. Earlier, in 2016, the eccentric musician and Blink-182 founder, Tom DeLonge, had been corresponding with members of the Obama administration about UFO disclosure. In those emails, later released by WikiLeaks, DeLonge mentioned that a government official had told him about something at the South Pole that was, in his words, so complex that it was going to take someone credible with a great ability to communicate to the public. The nature of that something was not specified in any document that became public. And in December 2016, Buzz Aldrin, the second human being to walk on the surface of the moon, traveled to Antarctica. He was 86 years old at the time. He was evacuated for medical reasons shortly after arriving, but not before posting from Antarctica a cryptic message on social media. It contained a photograph of a distant triangular mountain, partially obscured by cloud and mist, and the words, "We are all in danger. It is evil itself." The post was later deleted. Aldrin's representatives said he had been confused and unwell. The mountain in the photograph was identified as Mount Erebus, an active volcano, and a perfectly ordinary Antarctic feature. Whether the post was the confused communication of a very old man in a medical emergency or something else was never fully established. None of these visits prove anything. Unusual visits to unusual places happen for ordinary reasons all the time. But in the context of everything else Antarctica carries, they sit in the record with a particular kind of weight. Not proof of a secret, just a reminder that some of the most powerful and notable people in the world have been quietly drawn to the bottom of the world in ways they have not fully explained. Chapter 8. What the Ice Keeps. There is a version of the Antarctica story that has nothing to do with conspiracy, and it is worth telling clearly because it is remarkable on its own terms. The ice of Antarctica is a record. Every layer of it is a page in the longest continuous climate archive on Earth. Scientists drill ice cores, cylinders of compressed ice extracted from the depths of the sheet, and read them the way a historian reads a document. Trapped air bubbles in each layer hold samples of the atmosphere from the moment the snow that became that ice first fell. The carbon dioxide levels of the atmosphere 200,000 years ago. The methane concentrations of 400,000 years ago. The temperature records of 800,000 years ago, preserved in the isotopic ratios of the ice itself. Antarctica tells us things about the history of the Earth that no other source can. It tells us that the climate has been warmer and cooler than today, many times over the span of human civilization. It tells us that the pace at which it is now changing is without precedent in the ice record. And beneath the ice, the geology tells a different kind of story. A story of a continent that was not always frozen. Antarctica and Australia were once a single landmass. They separated around 85 million years ago. For tens of millions of years after that separation, Antarctica was temperate. It had forests. It had rivers. It had, almost certainly, a diverse ecology of animals and plants living on land that is now buried under 2 miles of ice. Fossils of those forests have been found. The impressions of ancient leaves and wood, preserved in rock that was once open to the sun and the rain, now locked under the ice sheet that began forming roughly 34 million years ago, when changes in ocean circulation tipped the continent into a permanent deep freeze. So the question of whether Antarctica was once habitable, once warm, once a place where living things could survive and flourish, is not a conspiracy theory. It is documented fact. The argument is only about the timescale. Was it habitable in the era of human civilization, or only in the deep time before our species existed? The geological consensus is deep time, 34 million years of ice. minimum. The Piri-Reis map, if it shows what Hapgood believed it showed, suggests something very different. And somewhere between those two positions, in the gap between what the geology says and what an inexplicable map appears to show, the mystery of Antarctica lives. Chapter 9. The Weight of the White. You can approach the Antarctica story from any direction and find the same quality at its center. Not proof of anything specific, but an accumulation of questions that do not have entirely satisfying answers. Why did the largest military expedition in polar history withdraw 8 months early, with no public explanation? What did Admiral Byrd mean when he warned of hostile invasions from the polar regions? How did a 16th century Ottoman admiral draw a map that appears to show a continent that was not officially discovered for another 300 years? What is generating high energy particle bursts beneath the Antarctic ice in ways that current physics cannot explain? What is the geological structure detected beneath the East Antarctic ice sheet in 2025 in the same region as the world's largest subglacial lake? Why did the nations of the Cold War, in the middle of their most intense competition for global influence, agree so quickly and so completely to share Antarctica? What drew a Secretary of State, a religious leader, an astronaut, and a musician turned government intelligence consultant to the same remote continent within the same 12 months? Each of these questions has a mainstream answer. Some of those answers are convincing, some are less so. All of them are more comfortable than the alternative. The alternative is that Antarctica has been, for decades, the site of discoveries significant enough to change how the most powerful governments on Earth understand their own position in the world. Discoveries that have been managed quietly, cooperatively, behind the barrier of a treaty that keeps the continent largely closed to independent investigation. That is not a comfortable thought. It is the kind of thought that you carry with you after the story is over, into the ordinary day, where it sits at the back of the mind, like a question that has nowhere to go. Chapter 10. Into the quiet. The ice is still there, 2 miles of it, above the mountains that no eye has ever seen. It evolved without sunlight, right now. Above the lake that has been sealed from the surface world since before our species walked upright. Above the geological structures that instruments are only now beginning to map. The research stations are still operating. The scientists are still drilling and sampling and measuring. The treaty nations are still meeting, still agreeing, still managing Antarctica within a framework that has now been in place for more than 60 years. And down there, in the dark, beneath the ice, something is alive. It evolved without air. It evolved in conditions that nothing in our experience of life on this planet would suggest could support it. And yet here it is, documented in DNA fragments pulled from lake water that froze in a borehole before anyone could stop it. Life finds a way. That is not a quote from a film. It is a biological fact confirmed at the bottom of the world. If life can survive in a sealed subglacial lake in Antarctica, it can survive in the subsurface oceans of Europa, the moon of Jupiter, sealed beneath its own miles of ice. It can survive in the oceans of Enceladus, Saturn's ice-covered moon, from which geysers of liquid water are erupting into space as you lie here tonight. The discovery at Lake Vostok did not just rewrite what we know about Antarctica. It rewrote the probable distribution of life in the universe. That is extraordinary. And it happened quietly, in a press release from a Russian drilling team, with a controversy about contamination that was never fully resolved. And then the world moved on. Maybe that is the truest thing about Antarctica. Not the theories, not the questions about what governments know or what maps show or what particles emerge impossibly from the depths of the ice, but the simple fact that the world's most extraordinary discoveries can happen quietly at the bottom of the world, and the rest of us barely notice. The ice keeps its secrets well. It always has. And in the quiet of tonight, the continent is down there, in the dark and the cold, holding whatever it holds, patient in the way that only something very old can be patient. You do not need to resolve any of it tonight. Just let the questions rest. Let the ice keep what it keeps. Let the dark at the bottom of the world be what it is. There is something calming, in the end, about mystery, about knowing that the world is stranger and larger than any of us fully understand, and that somewhere, 2 miles under the ice, something has been living in the dark for 15 million years, and it is still there. While you sleep, sleep well.